We're good? Excellent. All right, we're live.
Okay, we are live. I was just given the signal. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon here at WOA. Good morning to those on the West Coast. If you're joining us from around the world, good day, good time to you. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Happy Black History Month to those in the United States, Canada, and the UK. I recently learned, also celebrates Black History Month. To everyone else, happy Tuesday or whatever day it is where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. This is the first ever Leaders of Color speaker series at the Nature Conservancy. And we're really excited to have a special guest with us today. Whitney Tome is here with me. I'll introduce her and have her introduce herself shortly. My name is Blaze Jones-Yellin. I coordinate the LEAF program, Leaders in Environmental Action for the Future program out of the New York City metropolitan area, where we have hired hundreds of young high school interns to work, live, learn, and play on Nature Conservancy preserves during the summer. And I want to give a special thank you to all the states, chapters, folks who have participated, supported the LEAF program over the years, or who will begin to participate and support the LEAF program moving forward. We could not do this without you. So thank you to all of those folks. I also happen to be a founding member of the LEAD Steering Committee, the League of Employees of African Descent. We are one of the new ERGs, Employee Resource Groups, here at the Conservancy. We're all about collaborating with colleagues and peers to conserve and grow our Black people in service of nature. So we hope that you enjoy our first event. This is our first live, public, or external event at the Conservancy, and we hope to bring you some insights, stories, advice, general knowledge, and introduce you to some outstanding leaders of color from across the conservation spectrum. So we're also joined today by another LEAD Steering Committee member. Jalacia is joining us on the line. Jalacia, can you hear me?
It's a go.
Hi, Jalacia. Jalacia is going to be helping us moderate the online chat for those of you joining us from the internet. And we'll be helping to field some questions from the online audience. Jalacia, you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Blaze. My name is Jalacia Kroom. I'm the Associate Director of Communications in the Central Division. And I just want to be very brief because I want to get to the juicy stories and the information that Whitney's going to share with us today. But very briefly, just wanted to say again, it's an employee resource group. LEAD is an employee resource group. Take note of the word resource. We are here as a space to ask questions, even the questions that may be a little uncomfortable at times, but that's what we're here to do, is to kind of help dispel some of that discomfort and be able to answer questions not only for individuals but for business units who are looking to broaden support and broaden awareness. So if we think about the takeaways for today, that's what we would like the takeaway to be, for you all to know and be aware that not only is LEAD available to you, but the other ERGs as well as a resource, and also to create awareness about other groups and how they have been dealing with diversity and inclusion as a business matter. And again, just to know that we are here. So I'll pass it back to you, Blaze, and then when you get ready, please ask questions in the chat box during the session while Whitney's speaking, and we'll address those towards the end.
Thank you, Jalacia. Yes, and if you have questions and maybe you don't feel like the chat today is the place where you want to ask them, or if you're in the room here at WOA and today is not the time that you feel like you're ready to ask that question, or maybe you have a couple of lead-up questions for LEAD in advance of your big question, please email us. Please get in touch. Please, we are a resource for you, for the organization, for all of our learning. Okay, we're all on this learning journey together, and we want to be a resource for you. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. Our email address is lead@tnc.org. Lead@tnc.org. So it is Valentine's Day, so we want to do this with a little bit of extra love today, okay? Is that okay with folks? We want to have a nice, loving conversation and be in the spirit of love. Does that sound good to folks here in the room? Excellent. Another thing that we do in the black culture is call and response. So we may do some back and forth from up here on stage. I like to anyway. I can't speak for Whitney.
I'll join in.
Yeah, so today's conversation is relevant to all of us. All of us at TNC, we're all going through, this learning process, learning journey about diversity and inclusion. It could be especially relevant for anyone working to engage stakeholders, building partnerships, anyone who works on hiring, recruiting, supervising, anyone who does not know any people of color, anyone who does know people of color, or just wants to get to know one really special one a little bit better today. So we are joined by Whitney Tome. She is the executive director of Green 2.0 and Counsel to the Raben Group. She has worked with fishermen, environmentalists, advocates, political strategists, government employees, and thought leaders to develop the approach and solutions needed for the problem. Combining her facilitation skills, knowledge, and environmental issues, and understanding of people, Whitney is able to walk into any room, ask the right questions, develop a strategy in the moment, and leave everyone with action items and tasks. We love that here at the Conservancy. Prior to joining the Raben Group, Whitney served as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the National Parks Conservation Association, where she led, defined, and crafted metrics to measure and measures for the organization's diversity and inclusion efforts. Whitney has advised complex ocean stakeholders, processes as a program manager and mediator at the Meridian Institute, including facilitating public meetings for regional ocean planning bodies that included state, federal, and tribal partners. At the Environmental Defense Fund, Whitney served as a strategist, cat herder, and trusted advisor in dozens of state and federal political campaigns. She also worked, developed, launched, and grew the Fisheries Leadership and Sustainability Forum, a partnership between EDF, Duke, and Stanford universities. Whitney developed everything from the curriculum for fisheries managers to managing the steering committee, budget, and partners for the Fisheries Forum. Whitney has earned her bachelor's degree in political science from Middlebury College and a JD from American University's Washington College of Law, right here in Washington, D.C. And she's also won the International Chamber of Commerce's, the ICC International Mediation Competition in Paris, France. In addition to serving as counsel, Whitney is currently the executive director, as I mentioned, of Green 2.0, an initiative to increase the racial diversity of the largest national environmental NGOs, foundations, and federal government agencies. Wow. Welcome, Whitney. We're so glad to have you. I think we'd all like to start by hearing a little bit more from you, getting to know you a little bit better. And I know that one of the common denominators here for us is a love for nature. So I'd love to start with, how did you develop a love for nature?
So first of all, thank you so much for letting me come. I'm excited to be here. So my love of nature is actually entirely my mother's fault. Because she used to take, so she's been an elementary school teacher for 36 years and retired about 4 or 5 years ago, and always had largely third and fourth graders. And she used to take them out on a camping trip every year for a night, just their overnight. It was like, for some kids, it was their first ever overnight, outside in a tent. And the one I remember really vividly was the night that we had a torrential downpour, to the point at which it literally flooded out the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, and caused us to actually have to sleep in the bus for the rest of the night because it was so horrendous. And that was like my first, I think, real acknowledgement of like what the power of nature can be, and what it means. And just then, did camping with her and her students on and off from then on. But I think for me, the real time I realized like I might actually be able to do this was going to Middlebury College. I closed the doors. I still remember like closing the doors in my car in New Jersey and driving to Vermont and not wanting to open them until I got to Vermont. In part because the air just felt different in Middlebury. It was like, as a friend of mine used to say, the air so fresh it ought to be slapped. Because it was like one of those things where it felt cleaner. Like there was something about it and I was like, well, why is that? Why does Vermont have like what seems like palatably cleaner air? It's like, what is that? Versus home in New Jersey, which it's the Garden State. Trust me, it is actually the Garden State for a reason, I promise. But the part I live in was still like lots of farmlands and stuff like that, even if the rest of Jersey people think of like the highway, Newark, and the airport. That is not all of New Jersey, I promise you that. But I think for me that was like the first like, oh, this is actually different. Maybe I could actually do this for like maybe a career or something. And so that's how it started, and then it turned into, yeah, I actually want to do this. But I can say more if you want.
Do you want to say more?
I can. I think it's because that started me on a path, but then I took a huge divergence and then came back to it, which is after undergrad, I actually became a professional ballerina for about 4 or 5 years. It's something I'd always done all my life, and I realized it was like the last clear chance I would ever get to dance, because at that point I was almost too old as it was, being 21, it sounds crazy. But it's true. And then, so that gave me the time while I was dancing to figure out where I wanted to go back to school and what that was going to look like. And that turned into my law degree. A realization of like, oh, I actually want to understand the law and environmental law and understand why it works, how it does, and what I can do to then hopefully help influence the policy around environmental issues.
Thank you. I've learned many things already. So you obviously didn't start off doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. How did you find your way into this role, into this work?
It's funny, and I tell people this all the time. Like, if you had asked me 10 years ago, would I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I would have laughed at you. Literally, I would have laughed at you and been like, not my job. I don't do that. I'm sorry. Because I never thought it was my gig. Honestly, I was like, okay, I'm a black woman. What else do I need? Like, do I really need to add diversity, equity, and inclusion to my list of things to like champion? No, thank you. But then when I actually was working at Environmental Defense Fund, I realized that when you work with fishermen and you do that all day, that I was always the only woman and the only woman of color in the room. There were often other women, but there were never another woman of color in the room. And I facilitated meetings with them and got them hopefully to come together and come up with different solutions and new solutions around the problems they were having around fisheries. And it was like, I realized I have to overcome multiple hurdles for them. A, I'm young, or at least I look it. I'm a woman. I look like an African American woman, even though there's much more complexity to that than what you see. And it was like, wow, I have to overcome a lot of things that get them to trust me, to manage a meeting, and then trust me to actually then shepherd that solution, whatever that is, actually through a process or to an outcome. And it was like, why is there no one else who looks like me? And it started just sort of as a question in the back of my head, as a start. At the same time, Environmental Defense Fund started its diversity committee for the first time. And it was then the executive vice president who said, all right, we're going to make this, we're going to do it, we're going to make it happen. I said, wow, an organization's really taking something around this seriously. And being in the oceans program, it was like, yeah, I'm one of like 2 people of color in the entire program of 50 people. Maybe I should get involved. Maybe I should actually see what this is about and see what the organization is really willing to commit to. What started as like, I'll show up for a meeting. 2.5 years later, I'm running the committee. A little after that, the committee has gone from 12 people to 65. And by the time I left, they were starting to step into their first ever diversity and inclusion plan for an organization. And so for me, it was a sort of like sticking me in the pot and then realize it was slowly boiling, you know? But it was a great recognition of like, wow, I actually care about this more than I thought I did. But there are also a lot of life things that happened in the interim. I got married, I had kids, and those things also changed my perspective. Because my husband isn't here, I can just describe him. He's a 6 foot tall, white, blue-eyed, dark-haired, white guy. Like, okay. Our kids, while they look like me and him, they're like the perfect blend of the two of us where people won't always recognize that they're with me. Or people will actually question if they're with me. And it was things like that, along with having now in-laws who are wonderful, amazing people, but also having an experience with them of them realizing that my experience in life is different from theirs. And for them to really say like, wow, what's that like for you? Like the first time that somebody questioned whether or not our kid was mine, my mother-in-law actually happened to be there and just sort of looked like, oh my God, that wouldn't have occurred to me. But for her, it was like, this happens to you? It's like, yeah, it happens to me. And she was like, what? And she was kind of blown away. But then over the course of our time and history and relationship, she now feels comfortable asking me piles of questions about race, about gender, about other things that hadn't occurred to her. She's in the baby boomer generation, so she's now retired, enjoying life, you know, wonderful, takes our children for like weeks on end, I love her. But one of the things is like, she hadn't realized what had happened because she didn't experience it. But getting to know me allowed her to experience it and also allowed me to vocalize some things in a very different way. Of like, oh, I have to explain this to you because you have never experienced it. How do I do that? How do I do that effectively and also build trust in a relationship with somebody who I want to keep for a long time? So it's been sort of an interesting both personal and professional arc, but they both have to work almost simultaneously in stepping into this work.
Wow, thank you. There was a lot in that response. I'd like to go back to one of the things you mentioned that really resonated with me about the experience of being the only one in a lot of situations. What kind of impact did that have on your development?
It's a great question. For a long time, I didn't really think about it, to be honest. Like, I grew up in a private school in Princeton, New Jersey. I was the only one for a long time. Like, I was the only black kid for a long time. So for me, it was like the norm for a long time. But it's only when I realized, like, maybe that isn't actually a norm. It's a norm for me, but it isn't a norm for everybody. And so it was like the flipping of my brain around stepping into rooms all the time and being the only one, that it was like, should that be a norm? Should it be different? And why? But what I think it has helped me developmentally is to be a really great code switcher, of where I can step into almost any situation, get a good sense of what it is and where I should meld myself to fit that situation. It makes me, is in part why it makes me a good facilitator, is because like I try to match the situation that's there rather than crafting it to match me. And so that helps. There's also downsides to that, you know, where like I mold myself to everything else. And sometimes I have to take a step back and be like, no, I need to actually make a principled stand right now rather than molding to the place or molding to the thing. And that's something that you have to learn how to do and when you want or when you don't want to do it.
Thank you. So to bring that to the present, we have an environmental movement facing the greatest challenges in human history. And yet, we know that we absolutely need all hands on deck. And yet, when we look around the conservation movement, people of color seem to be relatively few and far between, especially at leadership levels in a lot of big organizations. There's also a perception that people of color somehow care less about environmental issues. So before we go into your the new report released by Green 2.0, and since it is Black History Month, I'm hoping you can share some historical context, provide some historical context for the present situation and maybe talk a little bit about the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion and people of color in the conservation movement?
It's a great question. I mean, when I think back, I sort of go in like phases, and I start back to like the founding of our country, or what we describe as the founding of our country. So the founding of our country is really, sort of precipitated by Europeans coming to this country. Well, that wasn't really the founding of our country. There were people who were already here. And I think back to I had a great aunt who was 104 when she died, who was a full-blood Cheyenne Indian. And I think about her stories and the stories that I got just snippets of because I was only 2 when she died, but we sort of tried to retain some of that. That history and that heritage that she had about caring for the land, traveling it, being a nomad, is sort of the origin story of our country. Then we have, quote unquote, the founding of our country, which is when Europeans came and founded America. And then we have what happened post that. So we have sort of like camps of people, in part, thinking about how we conserve things, how we protect things. But that ethic, at least in humanity for me, is constant. But there are moments in time where people take up the mantle of being conservationists or environmentalists, for whatever reason, and either do or do not incorporate the history of the previous people who are there. So I'm just going to put that out there as one thing. Then there are moments in time since America was founded to figure out what happens afterwards and who conserves and who has the right to conserve, who protects it, why they protect it, and what that looks like. And we all think of, like Teddy Roosevelt being the great founder of like the national park system and what it means to conserve huge, wide open spaces. That's one moment in time, but most people forget that along with that trip, one of the people who was on that trip who was in like almost no photograph was the camp cook. He was an Asian man. Nobody tells his story, or we don't hear much about it. Or the Buffalo Soldiers, who were actually the first true sort of managers of Yosemite National Park. Those are stories you don't always get told. But the history of conservation does include a wide range of people. And the question is, who's telling the story? That's sort of the first part. And then you think about sort of the more modern environmental movement of when people started protecting things from pesticides, DDT, sort of all of the harms that were coming from other things. And you started the beginning of really mainstream environmental movement. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, all the sort of iconic Endangered Species Act. Those were largely middle-class whites who really started a lot of that movement, protected a lot of those things. I think of Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. Great, iconic, wonderful books that really started the resurgence of this. But recognize sort of what happens in the interim, what happens to all those other voices and people who cared about, who protected, who defended the lands, the waters, the air. And conservation has gotten to a point where, especially since the modern environmental movement, has been mainly white. Like, I'm just going to call it what it is. I don't like to hide the ball. It's not a bad thing, it just is. And now it's a question of, all right, so how do we take and harness that power around trying to protect the planet that we hold so dear and making sure that everybody's involved in it? Because in the end, if we kill our planet, we all die. Like, it's not all of a sudden going to pick other people. Like, it's not like some people are going to live and some people aren't. Like, we're all going to go. And so why not get absolutely everybody committed to water, air, and land? Because without those things, we're toast. The other thing, you mentioned this, and there have been some really wonderful, polling done, especially around people of color, whether that's Latinos, African Americans, Asians, especially around climate stuff. They, generally speaking, rated higher than whites. Environmental issues. Why not harness that power? Wow, that's amazing. Like, use that. If there are people who care about it, who rate it higher than other issues, bring them in. You care about this? Let's motivate you and get you committed to this movement and this work. Because it affects us all. Kids with asthma. I've got a kid with asthma. So I think about these things, and it's like, all right, what motivated me to get into this, but what will motivate everybody is like, if you don't have clean drinking water. Flint, Michigan, perfect example. Standing Rock, wonderful, iconic moment going on right now of where, probably for the first time in at least my lifetime, you had an Indian tribe who was willing to stand up and really fight for something and got the world to care about it. Wow, what a moment. Harness that power. Harness that collective effort to make change. All right, I'm going to stop now.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you. So you mentioned that people of color actually often rank environmental issues higher than other groups. In the new report by Green 2.0, Diversity Derailed is the title. Folks can go and Google that. Green 2.0, Diversity Derailed is the name of the new report. You talk often, so first I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about Green 2.0 and the report. But going back to this issue of perspective and perception, that folks perceive people of color maybe to care less, or they perceive there to be certain barriers to people of color entering conservation organizations. So I'd like to go back to that after you tell us a little bit about Green 2.0 and the basis for the report.
Sure. So Green 2.0 really started sort of publicly in 2014. And it was finally really documenting how many, especially women and people of color, were in the environmental movement, meaning in jobs. Like people who work for NGOs like TNC, people who worked for foundations, and people who work for federal government agencies to say, like, what's our actual statistics? Like, do we actually have a baseline to start with? And this was in part precipitated by actually someone, my boss actually, Robert Raben, stepping into a room of one of the galas of one of the big green groups and realizing that there was like no person of color who wasn't a waiter. And it sort of baffled him of being like, what? Is this normal, or did I just walk into like an anomaly? And that was sort of his first question. And that's how Green 2.0 got started, which is saying like, is that anomaly, or is this actually sort of fact? And so with our first report, we actually documented, right, how many people were we really talking about in this movement? And on the upper end, and this was mainly in federal government, you had about 15, 16% of people of color in jobs. Usually for foundations and NGOs, it was about 12%. Okay, that's our baseline, great. The question is, okay, so does that baseline also change depending on where you are in the organization? Whether that's you're at the intern level, staff, senior staff, or like C-suite, or board. And you watched a precipitous drop off as you got higher up in that hierarchy. Whereas most boards, they might have 4% people of color. And it was like, all right, let's try to actually change that. And Green 2.0 takes a couple approaches. One is saying like data transparency. We want organizations to actually publicly collect and submit their data to GuideStar, which is the charity navigator, and say, do it. Show us where you are. And then what we also do is provide resources around, all right, if you want to get better, we're happy to help you or provide resources or tools to make it easier for you to change. Best practices, good examples, things like that. And that's why we did, in part, the Diversity Derailed report, which was saying, all right, at the C-suite level, when you're looking for the new CEO, when you're looking for the new vice president, you often hire a search firm and say, go find me a wonderful smattering of candidates for this position. Our question was, well, are both those groups, the NGO and the search firm, actually looking for the same thing? Are they consistent in what they mean about diversity? And do they drive it all the way to the end? Those were sort of our three core questions. And the answer was no, across most of them, which is, you might have said diversity at the first meeting you had with your search firm. You might have mentioned it at the second. By the time you got your final slate of candidates, you may or may not have pushed hard, or if at all. As a search firm, you might have heard that from a client. Some of you actually did it and do it no matter what. Some of you will only do it if a client really forces you to do it. But then to get to your question about perceptions, it was also really fascinating to understand, that's why I love Professor Maya Beasley, who helped us do this report, of like, what was the problem? What caused you not to either advance diversity or push it? And often it was things like an overemphasis on cultural fit. That candidate has to fit our culture, has to fit the place. Like, is that really what you need? Or do you need an amazingly talented human being who can do the job? Who might also change your culture in the end. But not that that's a bad thing. Also, time constraint. Everybody wants everybody now. They want this person in the job 3 weeks ago. But if you give a little bit more time, who knows what you can accomplish and who knows what you can find. And I actually have an example of this that happened in the last 2 weeks. Somebody called me up, said they were in the final stages of picking a candidate. They had done interviews, but they didn't have a person of color. I said, do you want me to find somebody? Yes. Okay. They're now pulling out that time frame a little bit now, because I was able to find them at least one good candidate who was willing to sort of met all the criteria they were looking for, who's willing to move because this job is somewhere else. Who knows what'll happen? But what a great opportunity for somebody who is alarmingly talented, has all the skills that they need, and for some reason, search firm couldn't find them. I took one phone call. So in part, it's saying, I'm willing to push myself outside of my comfort zone, and I'm willing to ask more people than I normally would, because who knows what I'm going to find. I might find the most talented person I never thought I had, maybe even someone who isn't in the environmental space.
And it often doesn't take, at least from what I've read, it doesn't take necessarily a lot of candidates of color to change the outcome or influence the selection process. You talk about the Rooney Rule. I know Heather Wishick has talked about the Rooney Rule in the past, our chief diversity officer. For those who haven't heard of this, what is this concept?
Yeah, so I'd say actually there are two great things. One is the Rooney Rule, what happened in the NFL. I know, National Football League. Who said I would be ever quoting the National Football League? But I am. They made a decision back in the 90s to actually say, all right, if you're going to hire a new head coach or general manager, you have to interview at least one person of color for that job. One. You watch, since then, the NFL, when it comes to head coaches and general managers, you've actually seen a change, a pretty marked one over the last 15 or so years in the people of color who actually have that head coach or general manager spot. That was a really great decision for them. Most recently, the Harvard Business Review also did a similar study on, what is it actually going to take to change? Is it just one? Or is it two? Or how many would it take in a final candidate pool to potentially actually change the outcome? And what they said is basically if you have 2 women or 2 people of color in your pool, you can potentially change the outcome by either 79 times or 193 times. It's remarkable. And so literally, 2 candidates, if you get 2 candidates, it doesn't matter the size of the pool. The pool can be 10. The pool can be 100. The likelihood that you might actually pick one of those people goes up like an order of magnitude.
70 to 100 times.
Pretty cool.
Wow. So it doesn't take much, folks. Great, fantastic. So before we go to questions from our audience, I'm hoping you can take us into the future a little bit and tell us about what you see as maybe the biggest impacts for your work with people in nature moving forward, or maybe how this time might be different from times that, I know I've heard stories. I haven't been at the Nature Conservancy too long, but I know folks who have been around for much longer have talked about previous iterations of diversity initiatives and things that have failed in the past. What's different about this time, or how are we going to move forward? How do you see your work moving forward?
It's a great question. To be honest, for me, it's actually been sort of surprising, even that Green 2.0 has taken off and made such an impact in the short time it's been around. I mean, I've been in the environmental movement, 10 plus years, and I know people for decades, and half of the working group has been in this field for 20, 30 years, and is like, okay, we're doing this again, let's see if we can really do it. They cross their fingers, and they really hope. But what I've seen is actual real organizational commitment in a way that I hadn't in the same way before. The fact that 3 years ago, there was one person who had the title of like diversity and inclusion manager in any of the top environmental nonprofits. Now I think we have 7. Wow, that tells me something. There's also now people with dedicated budgets and resources to actually make this happen. Committees are being formed and created and trying to figure out what's our next step. Do we have a plan? How do we include this in our next strategic plan? So I feel like organizations are now really trying to tie it closer to mission, which is where it needs to be. Because in the end, we talk about the ecosystem, we talk about biodiversity, we talk about all these wonderful, amazing things, and we often forget ourselves in that conversation. We, the humans, are part of that ecosystem. And we need to be just as diverse as the birds and the megafauna and the plants and everything else that we protect to defend it. Same thing. But for some reason, we often pull ourselves out of like we need to protect everything else. It's like, well, we need to protect us who come and do this work in the same way. And so part of it is also a framing question of, people are finally getting the frame around, oh, we're human, we're part of this, we need to be as diverse as the things we care about. The other thing that's really fascinating is intersectionality. It's been really fascinating for the last, I'd say almost year and a half, to watch more environmental organizations sort of step a little bit out of their lanes to defend different things, whether that's Black Lives Matter, whether that's the Orlando shooting, whether it's, and I've seen, especially Mark Turk just put out simple statements about these things, but that's huge. Like the environmental movement rarely got out of its lane on anything, let alone sort of prescient things of their time. But that tells me that people are seeing the intersectionality of their lives and work in other places. Defenders of Wildlife put out a statement regarding the border wall that was also more about immigration than I'd ever seen an environmental movement do. And I was like, wow, way to go. Because they realized the intersection between migrants and people and the birds and other megafauna they protect. It was a really fascinating thing. So I feel like the consciousness is changing so that eventually the actions and everything else will come with it, and it's starting to happen.
Amazing. Well, thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Whitney. I think now it would be the time to open the floor, if that's okay with you. If there are any questions in the room, as a reminder, we are here, LEAD is here as a resource, so if you're hesitant to ask now, please feel free to email us at lead@tnc.org. Jalacia is also on the line to field questions that may be coming in from our chat, but I think I'd love to start in the room here. If there's anyone here who has a question, I guess we'll start, and you can come up to the microphone here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Bob Tansey. I was born in Jersey City and grew up in Sussex County.
Easy.
Excellent.
So I have a question I'll put in terms of mission. So in terms of the mission of the Nature Conservancy, what would the ideal be? Should our executive team, board, staff, and membership look like America? Thank you.
So I think given also TNC's breadth and depth and the international nature also with you do your work, I think ideally yes, but it should also look globally. It needs to have that good composite of both the U.S. domestic demography, because that's where you're sort of based in headquarters, but also make sure that you bring in especially those international voices in the international places in which you work to also be on your staff and board. So for me, it's a both and. And to date, you guys have done, pretty well on that, which is good to see, at least on the, especially the staff level. And the question is, how do you continue to elevate that when it comes to board seats, when it comes to the executive team? But that should be the goal, but realize it's a moving target. So the demography of the U.S. is what it is today, but in 20, 30 years, it's going to change markedly. And so also, are you tracking that? Are you able to match that as it changes as an organization? So I think both and.
Thank you. Other questions in the room? And I like the introduction. Tell us where you're from if you have a question. That online too. Tell us where you're asking your questions from. Anyone else here? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm originally from Maryland. Thank you for this. This has been great. I hope you guys do a bunch more of these. I have two questions, actually. One, could you touch on tips, tools, techniques for addressing unconscious bias? Particularly, you see that in the hiring process, like you mentioned, the cultural fit. And so I think it would be helpful to just hear more about that and see what TNC might be doing to address things like that. And then two, what can we do, particularly if we're not maybe in a position of hiring authority, but just ensuring more people of color get in the room when conversations are being had about a particular effort, initiative, program, both just in strategizing, but also decision making. Thanks.
Thank you for the questions. So I'll start off with the first one, which is when we did the diversity derail report, one of the things I was uncomfortable with it going out with was like, until we had a checklist. Until we had something that was like, what do you do? Like, okay, so I know this is a problem, but what in the world do I do about it? Like, I'm not happy being like, great, you got a problem, good luck with that, bye. Like, that's not helpful. So what we actually did is drafted a checklist, and it's literally just 2 pages. It's front and back of 1 page. And it actually articulates for an organization what you can do in the hiring process to try to minimize bias, or at least to try to cabinet and figure out where it happens or how to minimize it. And then on the flip side was around your search firm. What should you ask them? What kind of criteria do you use to then decide whether you hire them or don't hire them, and then what they hopefully can showcase to you that they can deliver? So that was that, and so as we tried to articulate that, along with about 4 or 5 best practices around structured decision-making process in the hiring process. Who's on the committee? Who's on the interview panel? And are there clear rubrics on which you're going to judge each candidate? Because if there aren't, that's often where you get a lot of sort of squishiness, for lack of a better word, and bias comes in. Because if you're not clear about what you actually need or how you're going to judge people, it's allowed to be sort of much more bias-ridden. The other thing that you asked was around other decision-making processes and how to get people in the room. I'd say it starts with you. Of like, if you're a person who steps into that room all the time and recognize like, so-and-so would add a great perspective here. Talk with whoever the leadership is, whoever the convener of that meeting is, and be like, I think you really should ask so-and-so to either come to the next meeting or to provide some insight. Because it starts with pointing out that there might be a perspective that they're missing. And then often people are usually welcome being like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or it hadn't occurred to me. It also depends on time constraint. If it's a decision that needs to get made in the next hour, okay, you can't. I recognize that. I used to do political strategy. I get it. I can't always include everybody. But when you can, do it. And do it intentionally. But ask people. And then also, encourage that when you do hold your own meetings, who do you include? And why? Like, as a facilitator, someone who steps into rooms a lot, I'm always really careful about who gets invited and why. And make sure that I don't leave anyone out who truly has a good, valuable, or insight that I'd be missing otherwise. Like, if I don't get through all the matrix of sex, age, race, gender, all of those things in the room, I'm missing something. And I'm not going to come up with a good solution in the end or a durable one. So it's also sort of doing that mental matrix, which I often do in my head a lot.
The unconscious bias question or issue brings up a question for me. We often hear folks at the Conservancy use the language assume good intent. And I fully agree with that. But in situations where there may be unconscious biases, or often there may not be unconscious biases, but the best of intentions can have serious negative consequences, impacts, potentially. So I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were about the balance, or how to navigate intent and impact in this work.
This one's always complicated because my husband in his school uses the same ground rule, assume best intent, and they've stepped into these issues really quickly. And actually, one happened like a week ago for them, where somebody really intended something good around Black History Month, said something that then offended somebody else, and then like you watch the cascade of things happen. And it wasn't, I know both people involved. I know what happened here, that like one person intended this to be really good, but didn't understand its impact and and now they both own it, but they had to have a long conversation around how they were going to do that collectively. And it's in part being willing and having a culture of like willing to raise your hand when something doesn't quite match. And being like, I'm sorry. And it's often actually asking questions rather than going right at it of like, I'm offended. Sometimes you got to do that. I won't stop you from doing it. But also think of like, so what made you say that? Why did that occur to you? Or can you explain what you meant by that? And often by asking those critical questions, you really get to understand what's behind it. And usually it is good intent. But usually it's either a lack of awareness of the impact, or a lack of understanding that like, oh, that hadn't occurred to me that that could be a problem. And so if you don't know and nobody flags it for you, you have no way of correcting it. And so you have to be able to do that and do it in a safe but hopefully gentle kind of way so that it makes somebody aware of the problem.
Sorry, you guys have a ton of questions online, and they should be coming up on your.
They are.
So you probably want to get to those.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosita. I guess should we just go down the list here? The first question is there a difference between talking about and addressing diversity and inclusion versus talking about and addressing race? Are diversity and inclusion programs sufficiently addressing race?
It depends. I don't have an elegant answer to this, but it depends on the focus of your diversity, equity, and inclusion program. I think if you think about diversity really broadly and largely, like I'm a lawyer by training, I think of like all the protected classes. I think of race and gender and sexual orientation and like all these things. But you can't usually do everything all at once. So often you have to pick what you need to focus on or start somewhere and then build on from that. And you guys have had a lot of focus on like women, other issues, and the question is, what do you pick off and then what do you do? Realize that race is enormously complex. You can watch it play out right now in politics and in the world, but that you have to take a targeted approach depending on the issue. So gender, you will probably treat a little bit differently than race, but there's also an intersectionality between race and gender. And so depending on what you want to do as an organization, you potentially have to drill down on each of those sub-pieces with a little bit greater care to make sure that you actually come up with the tools and approaches that are actually appropriate to that specific issue. So it can be a both and, but realize that just doing a blanket like, we did our diversity training for a day and we're good, is not going to cut it in the end. It's going to be a prolonged sort of absorption of this stuff because it's changing mental images and mental things that you've processed for a long time. And you have to sort of decouple those and pull them apart a bit. And that won't take a day or even an hour. For me, I mean, it's been 10 years and I still got another 70 or 80 to go. Hopefully.
So here's a question that I think is... Hello.
Can I just interrupt real quick?
Sure.
Hello, this is Jalacia.
Hi,
I've
Jalacia.
been tracking. Hello. I've been tracking these questions so I can kind of see, and I don't want you to have to scroll, but there are a couple questions too, maybe specifically for the management team who are looking at their staff in a particular way and how to just be a little bit more inclusive. There's a question on here about when a individual staff person feels microaggressions. What tools or what tips can you share with us so that both parties are still relatively comfortable but able to address these issues when someone's feeling those microaggressions?
Yeah. These are always funny because they're usually small, but they accumulate over time. And usually when a person feels like they've heard a couple of them, they've now gotten to the point where they've heard so many that sometimes they need to take a sort of step back and say, all right, I need to approach this person with as much of good intent as I possibly can, but to point out where there have been instances and give specific examples to this person around when you feel like you've seen or where you've experienced a microaggression. And to clearly articulate like when it's happened, what was the context, and what was the thing said or communicated. Because until somebody understands that at a really fundamental level, they're not going to be able to modify or even consider modification of the behavior. So that's one thing. Two is recognize that depending on who it is, it can get super complicated. Your boss versus your colleague versus somebody up the chain 3 or 4 ways, it can be very different because you're going up against power dynamics at the same time. And so you've got to figure out what's the best approach, what does that look like, and do you need support? Because for sometimes you might need support. You might need a colleague or a friend or another person who's at that person's same level that can support you in that conversation depending on how involved, how complicated it is, or what your rapport is with that person. And so it's a lot of factors that work all at once, but I think it's valuable to approach it and just to lay it out very cleanly and just articulate the impact to you without assuming what that person had or what they intended, but rather saying, this is how it felt to me, and I just want to articulate that to you. Thank you, Jalacia.
Thank you, yes.
That was really helpful, and I know that we have lots of questions up and down this chain here, but I wanted to tap in just one other quick question. I'm in marketing, but I'm in the room with development, so I feel the need to ask this question here. What about the approach when reaching out to trustees or potential supporters? We want to be honest about where we're trying to go and recognize that we haven't quite made it to where we're going, but at the same time, we still have this business component to reach. We still have, development goals that we have to reach, and we want to make sure that those that communique is very diverse. So what's the approach on, especially since there are so many angles and things that we're trying to be sensitive about? What advice do you have to people that are in regular communication with trustees or trying to reach new trustees about supporting us, but at the same time recognizing where we still have this challenge in diversity?
I think it's in part like you do with every development department who's really good. They get to know the person that they're going to approach really well. They know their context. They know why they're going to approach them. They know what this person cares about, and it's putting it in that context. If this person truly cares about, let's say water in Africa, okay, that approach, then recognize the context of Africa, recognize the people you're talking about, and elevate then that sub-issue of dealing with the diversity in Africa, of dealing with the range of people and other things. So put it in the context of the either place or the issue. Because they're not decoupled, they are the same. And so often it's tying it to mission and just making it mission relevant. I mean, it's why TNC does its work. It's protecting the planet. It's conserving land and waters, That thing includes people. And it's just creating that wonderful, elegant language around the people part, that it's people in nature. And so it's doing that, and it's also thinking about who are the trustees even? Why do you pick your trustees? What does that look like? What's the pipeline look like for the next set of trustees? Are they people from a broad range across the world and across the country? You know, people think, well, you know, they're people who are really wealthy. Those are the people we want to go for. You know, I work for a big environmental group. I get it. But think about what's the tact for them? Who knows? There might be a trustee who's at that intersection of sustainability and diversity. I mean, we just haven't found them yet, but I wouldn't be surprised. For people who care enough about the planet or water or a specific issue and has a background or a history or a family member from a different culture or a different ethnic background. So it's in part also getting to know them and also using the relevance for TNC of showing why it matters. It's a business case. For you guys to continue to be successful, it matters. Full stop. I think most people get it, and most people, especially in the corporate world, will totally get it. They've been doing this for years. I mean, you want to get more customers? Well, guess what? Your customers are changing. I want to tap into the new millennials. I want to tap into the more Latinos, people of color in this country. Guess what? What do I have to do differently? They do it because they know that it turns into market share. And the same thing for a place like TNC. You want more people to care about this.
So the question, or a question that came up about, you know, finding that person, does that person exist? There's a question on here that I think is probably common out there, so I'd like to, it might be a softball for you, but have you looked at the candidate pool, at what the candidate pool actually looks like, especially at higher levels? If 90% of the individuals applying for a job are white, that's not the fault of the organization. Your response.
So I'd say it's maybe not the fault of the organization, but it's the fault of the movement. And by default, it's sort of the fault of the organization. Like to say that, you know, well, those are the people who walked in the door. Okay, who are you reaching out to? Who are you, TNC, engaging in this work? Who are you recruiting? Who are you going out to interview? What do you need? Like when it comes to both skill sets, talent, etc., you want to find the most talented person, period. And that person may or may not be in that talent pool. So why not look for, maybe there's a black engineer that you need to do hydrotechnology. I have no idea. Why would you lose out on leaving talent on the table just because you don't know that they're there? That's a loss to the organization. And that's a loss to the movement. So it's not just simply the, well, that's what we get. That also means you're not being proactive. You're not taking steps to say, I want to broaden and deepen our talent pool. I want to build a pipeline for the next 20 to 30 years. Because what you want a line of credit before you need it. You don't want the line of credit all of a sudden when you need it. Because that's too late. Then all of a sudden the credit card company's like, well, you missed this bill and you missed, too late. Too late. Do it now. Because honestly, like, I didn't really think I'd ever do oceans and fish. If I had looked at the job description of my first job, I probably wouldn't have applied. Because it demanded 1 to 3 years of fishery management experience. I didn't have it. But I had a colleague who said, just apply anyway. Okay. And a boss who took a risk. But then I took that job and did it for almost 6 years. Well, imagine what you'd gotten if you'd taken somebody else. They might have just been just as talented. Other people in the pool had fishery management experience. They'd been in the field, blah, blah, but you didn't get me. You lost me. You would have potentially lost me from maybe the environmental movement, period. Because that would have been my first job at a law school. And now I'm no longer in the movement. Who knows what I do? Maybe I go off and do tech. Who knows? But then my connection, my love, my commitment to this issue might diminish for me just not being in it. Okay, so now you've lost me, maybe entirely. We can't afford that. This planet can't afford that.
Got that right. Okay, I've got more questions here. Jalacia, you're welcome to chime in here if you got anything that's standing out to you. I'm having to read these and pay attention to everything happening in the room at the same time.
I'm here, Blaze, and yeah, there are a couple other questions. Let me just get this one real quick from Texas, and it's a question of retention. So once we kind of go through that process and we're looking at these different spaces in which to hire, and what are some tools that, again, management or others hiring staff, HR, can be thinking about in order to retain, Black or people of color? What are some tactics that you would share with them?
And this is really retention for like anybody, but do you have good professional development? It's sort of like, what's the baseline? What do you give everybody right now, and what does that look like? Start there. Does everybody get that equally? Yes or no? Ask yourself sort of some of those fundamental questions around what kind of professional development, what kind of resources do you provide your staff across the board? How many people utilize that? Is it largely clustered in a certain pocket or certain offices or certain programs? What's happening to really understand sort of what's the baseline? Start there. And the question then becomes, all right, as promotion season, as performance review season comes up, what's the criteria? What does that look like? Is the promotion process clear to staff? Is it clear to managers? And are there clear criteria for how you judge people when and if they get a promotion? Is that clear to them? What I need to do to excel and exceed and then make it to the next whatever. If that's not clear, that's where you got to start. Then the question becomes, why are people leaving? For what reason? And where do they go? And that becomes sort of an exit interview question to understand, are you leaving people because they're just better jobs other places in the environmental movement? Okay, that's one thing you can try to address. Are they leaving to go something totally not in the environmental movement? That's something very different. And to also understand, is there a cultural dynamic here that is also going on? And those are questions you really need to ask, both in the exit interviews, but also ongoing to your staff. You should, I think you guys already do this. I'm going to ask, I'm looking back to Rosina in the back. You're doing cultural surveys of the organization on a regular basis to get a sense of where you also are as an organization. But also cut it by department or program or other things to understand, are there unique pockets in the organizations that are really doing this well, that are succeeding in both keeping and retaining their staff across the board and or people of color that are doing it well? Well, what are their factors? What are they doing well? Versus maybe other parts that aren't. What's going on there? So that's what I'd like to say about that. My hope and dream actually with Green 2.0 is do an actual report on this in the future, would be my hope and dream. That's the thing I'm sort of bubbling in my brain right now, which is how do I start actually understanding the promotion retention problem to really drill down on this? Because I have some sort of anecdotal statistics and or I've had long coffee talks with people who've left for reasons or another to actually take that in aggregate and say what's actually going on here as a movement. So that's my dream over the next year or so, to actually do that, to understand what's going on, and to give practical best practices around how you actually amend, change, or really keep and retain people in this movement. But that's something hiding back there in my brain.
You're working on it.
I am.
Much needed work. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's sending in questions online. One that I have here, that you've mentioned during the course of our conversation, Flint, Michigan. You've mentioned Dakota Access. These are much more environmental justice related issues, or you could bucket them that way. How would you talk about bridging the divide between mainstream environmental conservation and the growing movement for environmental justice?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing that we think of sort of the conservation movement, and then we've got all these little pockets that don't always work well together. So that's a problem we've actually got to fix as a starting point, which is we need to get these movements to actually talk collaboratively together and to trust each other. And there's been a lot of, I'd say, distrust over the years. I mean, and Blaise, when we started preparing for this, I mentioned what the 1990 letter from the 10, or no, almost 20 or 30 of the biggest sort of environmental justice groups to the biggest environmental group saying, you're not diverse enough, what are you doing about this? There was a blip in the world that went, oh, okay, you're right, there's a problem. There are a few organizations that did a couple of things, and then it just sort of trailed off. But not delivering on that helped to continue the rift between environmental justice and environmental issues. Because for environmental justice, it's usually place-based, generally speaking. There are obviously always exceptions. But thinking about, all right, the smokestack is actually polluting in my neighborhood right now, today. I don't have clean drinking water in Flint, Michigan today. These are like right now, I don't have basic sort of environmental rights. Versus the like, we need to pass a comprehensive like climate legislation, which covers like everything. And the problem is like we've always been working at those two parallel tracks, the very local issue and the very national issue. And what we need to realize is those things are actually work together. And you actually need to sometimes decide, at times, you put it all in on one, or all in on both, or all in on the other, but the people are willing to bend and flex to address those issues at different levels to see impact, where people actually need them. Like the fact that people don't have clean drinking water in Flint still, why isn't everybody figuring this problem out? Everybody under the sun. Like, drinking water? Basic. Super basic. And so it's like, all right, so what's going on here when that happened and some of the big green groups were able to step in and help with that, but some of them had to take a long time to figure out, well, how do we step in? What does that look like? How do we not step on too many toes? How can we do it authentically without bigfooting? I mean, there was like a lot that went on around that. And it's like, okay, there should have just been a pathway, a very clear one for like, all right, if we want to help, here's how we do it. But there wasn't, because there was still this distrust. And it's in part like people need to get to know each other as people, like fundamental level. Like if I know you as a person, I'll have a conversation with you. And over time, I'll tell you more about why I think it works or why it doesn't work, or challenge you on the things that I don't agree with you on. But until I have that trust with you, I'm not going to do it in a constructive way. And it's got to start there, which is like, bring people together for simple things. People are like, we've got to fix this problem. We've got to put it all in on like the clean power plant, blah, blah, blah. Those are short-term fixes. What you need is a long-term dialogue, a long-term ongoing dialogue to fix the conversation. So that like the head of TNC can pick up the phone at the head of WEAC in New York and have a conversation, and a good, meaty, thoughtful one, and figure out what they're going to do and what their plan is going forward. And that can't always happen right now, but it's got to.
Thank you so much. It's been great to get to know you a little bit better today and have this conversation. Before we wrap, I'd like to give the room a chance here. If there are any questions, burning questions in the room, or Jalacia, if you have anything, any final questions that you think we should be sure to get in front of Whitney while we have her?
I think that's about it as far as what's in the chat, but there are just obviously, as you can see too, just some comments that, you know, this is very powerful and there is momentum and we want to keep this going. And again, you know, us as a resource, we can very easily then tap back out to Whitney if we have, you know, other groups that are willing and have made certain progresses. Then we have opportunities to connect the dots too. So again, just reach out. I know time is short, but just reach out to lead@tnc.org if you have more questions. But on this end, we are A-OK. And thank you so much, Whitney, for your time and your deep thoughts and your sharing with us and just being open enough to share some of even your personal anecdotes with us. Very powerful and much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've got a question here in the room, and I think this will be the final one. And again, thank you. The chat is blowing up, as we say. And I can't even keep track of all the action here. So really, thank you to everyone participating online. Let's take our final question in the room.
Hi, I'm Joyce from Washington, D.C., and I guess I wanted to ask. I talked to my daughter about Whitney coming, and the thing that she said out of her mouth was, "Black folks don't care about the environment," and I want to know, what do you think we can do as an organization or as people of color to bring to light things that you talked about, like people of color and how often and how many are involved in conservation that we don't know about, because there is that image of us not recycling, for instance, and how many people are in the movement and passionate about the mission. How do we change that? What can I do besides like beat it into my kid's head? I mean, she's 34. It's only so much I can do right now, right? But exactly what can I do, or how can we get social media, the millennials, to understand that if the water's not good, you die. You can't live on a planet that doesn't have clean water. How do we get them back engaged and get people of color to know that there are people that care? There are many of us that care, and you should care too.
Start by telling your own story. Seriously. It's got to start with you and telling other people why you do this and why you care and why you're here. And then it's getting to know your coworkers and other people that are willing to also tell their story to you so that then you can tell it. And that's largely where we best interact as humans. It's like, if I understand your story, I'm more apt to both understand where you're coming from, to have more empathy, to have more compassion, to want to work with you, to want to collaborate. Like, there are all these things that happen as a result of getting to know you. So I'd say start like that. Feel free to tell my story. I'm not stopping you. Only because it's instructive. And I've told other people's stories. I personally always ask their permission before I do that, and before I put them in a spot of me telling their story for them. I'd rather have them do it. But also think about, who else do you know that you might want to bring to something that you haven't before, so they can tell another version of their story. And then it's also just visually, more people of color, in nature, in photos. Like, really simple. A lot of the environmental movement is really bad about it. We show this wonderful, beautiful, expansive landscape. Nobody's in it. Or if there is somebody in it, it's like one person. And we have to also change that about saying, like, look, I'm in nature. Take a selfie of yourself in nature. Put it up on Twitter. Like, start the cascade, but also make a commitment. Like, whenever TNC does a photo shoot or anything else, make sure that you have a range of people in that photo shoot, and then you plaster it everywhere. Like, those are the moments. The LEAF program especially, and has great opportunities, to use that and to push it out on a regular basis, because that's the story. And those are stories, I think, especially of LEAF, of like the kids who show up and go, that's a story. And that's another kid's going to be like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. It's like, well, you can. Come on out. We're here. And it's also reminding people that our parks and places are actually safe spaces. When I think about probably my mother's generation, some parks and spaces were not safe spaces at all. That's why books like the Green Book existed. If you don't know about the Green Book, you should hunt it down. But it's essentially the book of where African Americans could stay in the South. Could stay, where they would be safe to stay. And there were some places that you weren't going to show up there, either a town or a park or someplace else for the night, because who knows if you'd make it out. And so it's reminding people that those spaces are actually now safe. And they're beautiful and remarkable, but it's also changing your mindset around, like, wow, you can actually see the stars at night. Especially living here in DC. Like, we take our kids to national parks. We're going to go up to a national park in Canada next year. But that's, like, I take my nieces. I'm the person actually who's taken them to all of the national parks they go to. 2 young, teenage, blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls. The only reason why they get out to nature is me. Their parents don't take them. But that's, most people look at me and be like, really? I thought they would take you out. No, I take them. But it's thinking about how you flip that in ways that you maybe don't expect. But tell stories about it. Tell stories. Stories and photos. Stories and photos, man. Stories and photos.
And to build on that, I mean, terms you've used today are things like framing and intersectionality. You know, if you talk about Flint or New York City public school water quality, where there's lead in the water, and you make it about a health issue, clean water in my school, or clean air because I have asthma or I know somebody with asthma, or, you know, those personal stories and the context, the intersections are things that I use with the youth in the LEAF program to make things relevant to them. And they also have other examples that they see in their school, people who have done the program before them. And it builds a culture around the LEAF program, around environmentalism, conservation. And it becomes real, it brings it home. So I would just add that. This has been an amazing conversation, incredibly insightful. Thank you so much for being here, Whitney. Can we give Whitney a round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for joining us here, tuning in online, participating in the conversation. This recording will be available on Learn at TNC. We will also link to it on the LEAD Connect page. And we hope that you'll continue to be involved. Reach out, get in touch with LEAD, lead at tnc.org. We are recruiting members. We love your feedback. We love your participation, and we need you to get involved if we're going to accomplish our goals. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for participating. We're looking forward to the next one. Take care and have a happy Valentine's Day with your loved ones.